Growing up in our house in suburban Denver, Colorado, I thought it was normal that my mother, Linda Patterson, kept detailed records of every word we spoke. She started this system when I turned 7 years old, and my younger brother Jake was only 5. At first, she presented it like a game, telling us that words were precious and we should learn to value them. She showed us a brand new leather-bound ledger with our names written in gold lettering on the cover, explaining that she would track every single word we said, and we would pay her 1 penny per word at the end of each week. I remember that first Sunday when she called us into the dining room for what she called Collection Day. The mahogany table was covered with her accounting materials, calculators, and those leather ledgers that would come to dominate our lives. She had spent the entire week following us around with a small notebook, making tiny marks every time we spoke. Jake and I sat there, confused but curious, as she tallied up our weekly totals. I owed $3.47 for the 347 words I had spoken that week. Jake owed $2.15. We thought it was funny at first, reaching into our piggy banks to pay our mother for the privilege of talking in our own home. Mom explained her philosophy with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a revolutionary parenting technique. She said that in the real world, everything had a cost, and children needed to learn early that their words carried weight and consequence. She claimed that too many people in society spoke without thinking, filling the air with meaningless chatter, and she was determined that her children would grow up different. We would be thoughtful, deliberate, and precise in our communication because we understood the literal price of every utterance. My father, Robert Patterson, was a quiet man who worked long hours as an accountant at a firm downtown. He came home that first Sunday to find his children counting out pennies and dimes to pay their mother for speaking. His face went through a series of expressions that I can still picture clearly. Confusion giving way to disbelief, then to a kind of resigned horror as Mom explained her new system. She had already prepared a ledger for him too, though his rate was higher at 5 cents per word since he was an adult with a steady income. The first major argument happened 3 weeks into Mom's experiment. Dad had been trying to avoid talking at home, communicating through gestures and expressions whenever possible, but the strain was obvious. One Thursday evening, he finally exploded. I was in my room doing homework, but I could hear every word through the thin walls as he told her exactly what he thought of her word charging system. His voice grew louder with each sentence, years of frustration pouring out in an unstoppable flood. He called her controlling, manipulative, and insane. He said she was damaging her children and creating a toxic environment that would scar us for life. Mom sat there with her ledger and calculator, calmly tallying every word as he spoke. When he finally ran out of steam, she presented him with the bill. $1,847 for that single argument. She had been charging him at an increased rate of 50 cents per word for what she classified as aggressive speech. Dad stared at the number in disbelief, then walked out of the house. He came back later that night and slept on the couch, but something fundamental had broken between them. The surveillance system arrived 2 weeks later, and multiple cameras in every room, all feeding to a bank of monitors Mom set up in what used to be Dad's home office. She explained that she needed to ensure accurate accounting, that she couldn't be everywhere at once to count our words. The cameras would record everything, and she would spend hours each evening reviewing the footage, making precise tallies in her ledgers. She showed us the software that could isolate audio from specific rooms, allowing her to track multiple conversations simultaneously. Dad lasted exactly 1 month after the cameras were installed. The morning he left, he stood in the kitchen while Mom presented him with his latest bill. Including the big argument and various smaller infractions, he owed her over $3,000. He looked at the bill, then at her, then at Jake and me eating our cereal in silence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Without a word, he walked to the door, picked up the suitcase he had already packed, and left. Mom had his final bill framed and hung it in the kitchen as what she called a cautionary tale about the cost of uncontrolled speech. Life without Dad became a careful dance of necessity and silence. Jake and I developed our own systems for minimizing verbal communication. We would plan our sentences before speaking, editing out unnecessary words, combining multiple thoughts into single efficient statements. At breakfast, instead of asking, "May I have the orange juice, please?" I would simply say juice while pointing. Mom initially tried to charge us for what she called implied words, arguing that the gesture implied a full sentence, but she eventually conceded that she could only charge for actual spoken words. School became our sanctuary, the one place where we could speak without immediate financial consequence. But even that refuge didn't last long. Mom hired her cousin Marcus, an unemployed former security guard who needed the money, to shadow us at school. He would sit in the back of our classrooms with a notebook, documenting every word we spoke during presentations, group discussions, or casual conversations with friends. Teachers initially protested this intrusion, but Mom had prepared official-looking letters about a family medical study on childhood language development that required careful monitoring. The rates increased every year on our birthdays, Mom's twisted version of a birthday gift. When I turned 8, the rate jumped to 5 cents per word. By 10, it was 25 cents. On my 13th birthday, as I blew out the candles on a cake we ate in complete silence, she announced that my rate would now be $1 per word. Jake, who had just turned 11, was paying 50 cents per word. The debt began accumulating faster than we could possibly pay. I tried different strategies to manage the growing financial burden. I took on extra chores around the neighborhood, mowing lawns and walking dogs to earn money. But Mom always found ways to increase our verbal expenses. She would ask direct questions that required verbal responses, then charge us for the answer. She implemented surge pricing during what she called peak hours, doubling or tripling rates during dinner time or family gatherings. Holiday rates were especially brutal, with Christmas dinner conversation costing 5 times the normal rate. My first attempt at rebellion came when I discovered sign language. I spent hours at the library teaching myself ASL from books and online videos, then taught Jake in secret. For 2 wonderful weeks, we communicated freely through signs while Mom watched in growing frustration. But she was nothing if not adaptable. She enrolled in an intensive ASL course and within a month was fluent enough to understand our conversations. She then announced that sign language would be charged at double the normal rate since it was an attempt to circumvent her system. The psychological toll became increasingly apparent as the years passed. Jake essentially stopped talking at age 14 when his accumulated debt passed $4,000. He had always been a cheerful, chatty child who loved telling jokes and making up stories. Watching him transform into a silent, withdrawn teenager was heartbreaking. He would sit at dinner, moving food around his plate, his eyes dull and unfocused. When absolutely necessary, he would communicate through written notes, but Mom soon banned that too, calling it another form of cheating. I developed a different coping mechanism, becoming hypervigilant about every word I spoke. I would mentally calculate the cost of each sentence before speaking, often deciding that the thought wasn't worth expressing. My teachers noticed the change, commenting on report cards that I had become reluctant to participate in class discussions despite clearly understanding the material. My English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, kept me after class one day to ask if everything was okay at home. I wanted desperately to tell her everything, but I knew Mom would see the conversation on her surveillance footage, and the resulting charges would be astronomical. The financial control extended beyond just charging for words. Mom had complete access to any money we earned or received as gifts. Birthday checks from grandparents went straight into her account to pay down our word debt. When I got my first part-time job at 16, working at a grocery store after school, she demanded my paychecks be direct deposited into an account she controlled. She would graciously apply my entire earnings toward my accumulated debt, which by then had surpassed $12,000 despite my careful silence. Her accounting methods grew increasingly sophisticated over time. She developed a complex system of categories and multipliers. Complaining cost double. Arguing cost triple. What she deemed disrespectful speech could cost up to 10 times the base rate. She had special charges for various types of words, with profanity costing a flat $100 per word regardless of context. She would spend entire evenings reviewing her footage and updating her ledgers, cross-referencing conversations and applying her ever-expanding rule system. The physical punishments for non-payment evolved gradually but inevitably. At first, it was simply loss of privileges. No dessert, no television, no time with friends. But as our debts grew beyond any possibility of payment, she needed new leverage. She instituted standing punishments, where we would have to stand facing the corner for 1 hour per $100 owed. Jake once stood for 40 straight hours, only allowed to sit for bathroom breaks, because he had asked her why she was doing this to us. The food restrictions were particularly cruel. She developed a system where we could work off debt by accepting reduced rations. 1 grain of rice equaled $1 of debt forgiveness. I would sit at the kitchen table, counting out individual grains of rice while my stomach growled. 100 grains barely made a dent in what I owed, but left me hungry for hours. She would eat normal meals in front of us, occasionally commenting on how delicious her food was while we picked at our meager portions. The bathroom and kitchen locks appeared during my junior year of high school. Overnight, accessing basic necessities required payment. $2 to use the toilet, $5 for a shower, $10 for anything from the refrigerator. She installed card readers on each lock, and we had to swipe a special debt card that would add the charges to our running total. I learned to limit myself to 1 bathroom trip during the school day and to shower at the gym after physical education class. My coworkers at the grocery store began to notice my odd behavior. I spoke to customers in the shortest phrases possible, often just pointing or nodding instead of verbal communication. During breaks, I would sit alone in the corner, not joining in the casual conversation. Sarah, who worked the register next to mine, finally cornered me in the break room one day when she found me crying over Mom's latest bill showing I owed $37,000. The font was small and precise, detailing every word I had spoken that month with timestamps and categories. I had made the mistake of giving a presentation in my history class about the Civil War, and Mom had charged me triple rates for educational speech because she said I was showing off. Sarah read through the bill with growing horror, then pulled me into a hug as I sobbed out the whole story and whispered fragments. Too afraid of the cost to speak normally even away from home, Sarah immediately offered me her couch and began helping me plan an escape. She was 23 and had escaped an abusive relationship 2 years prior, so she understood the careful planning required. We communicated exclusively through written notes at work, which I would immediately destroy. She helped me open a bank account that Mom didn't know about, where I could hide cash tips. We researched emancipation laws and what I would need to prove abuse. The weight sensors were Mom's latest innovation. She had installed pressure-sensitive pads under every piece of furniture, in our closets, under our mattresses. Any change in weight would send an alert to her phone. She claimed it was for security, to know if someone was stealing from us, but we knew it was to prevent us from hiding anything. The night she found my packed bag under the bed, her phone had beeped with an alert about unexplained weight in my room. She confronted me at dinner, my hidden escape bag sitting on the table between us like evidence in a trial. Marcus stood behind my chair, his hand resting on my shoulder in what might have looked like affection, but felt like a threat. Mom pulled out a new contract, explaining that the rate would now be $50 per word, retroactive to birth. She showed me calculations proving that I had actually owed millions since speaking my first word as a baby, and she had been generous in only charging from age 7. 3 years of near silence shattered in that moment. The words erupted from me like water breaking through a dam. I told her she was insane, that you couldn't charge babies for learning to speak, that her entire system was abuse disguised as parenting. Each word felt like rebellion, like reclaiming something that had been stolen. I watched her face remain calm as she tallied the charges, her pen moving steadily across the ledger while I unleashed years of suppressed thoughts. When I finally stopped, my throat raw from speaking more in 5 minutes than I had in months, she calculated the total. $43,000 in new charges from that single outburst. Adding it to my existing debt brought the total to $80,000. She closed the ledger with a satisfied smile and walked to a drawer I had never seen her open before. Inside was an array of medical instruments that made my blood run cold. Scalpels, clamps, syringes, and tools I couldn't even identify. She picked up a particularly vicious-looking scalpel, turning it so the overhead light caught the blade. Her voice was conversational, almost friendly, as she explained that she had been researching more permanent solutions to children who couldn't learn financial responsibility. "Did I know," she asked, "that there were relatively simple procedures to damage vocal cords? That a skilled person could make it look like an accident or illness? That sometimes when children insisted on talking, despite the clear cost, the kindest thing was to remove the temptation entirely?" Jake suddenly stood up from his chair with such force that it fell backward. He walked to the kitchen drawer with deliberate steps and pulled out the largest knife from the wooden block. Before any of us could react, he held it to his own throat, the blade pressing against his skin hard enough to leave a white line. His eyes locked on Mom's as he applied slightly more pressure, a tiny bead of blood appearing where the blade met skin. His meaning was crystal clear even without words. Forgive our debts or watch your son die in front of you. For the first time since implementing her system, I saw uncertainty flash across Mom's face. But it lasted only a moment before her expression hardened into something colder than I had ever seen. She looked at Jake with the same dispassion she might show to a stranger on the street and spoke 5 words that shattered what remained of our family. Go ahead, the debt transfers. She pulled out another contract, explaining that she had thought of everything. If either of us died, our accumulated debt would transfer to the surviving sibling. If we both died, it would be donated to a charity she had established for promoting fiscal responsibility in children. There was no escape through death, only more debt for the survivor. Jake's hand trembled as tears rolled down his face, and I could see him struggling with the realization that even this ultimate act of defiance would only hurt me. I moved without thinking, lunging across the table to grab the knife from Jake's hand. He released it without resistance, crumpling back into his chair as the weight of our hopelessness crushed him. I threw the knife into the sink where it clattered against dirty dishes, then caught Jake's eyes and mouthed 2 words as clearly as I could manage. Trust me. He was beyond believing in hope, but he gave the tiniest nod while Mom watched us with satisfaction. She had already pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts with efficient movements. I heard her select a name and press call, then turned slightly away as someone answered. Her voice was bright and professional as she confirmed an appointment for the next morning, requesting that all necessary equipment be brought as previously discussed. She mentioned payment of $15,000 from an education fund she managed, and my stomach dropped as I realized she was spending my college savings on whatever procedure she had planned. The conversation continued for several minutes as she discussed logistics and medical details that made my skin crawl. I heard her mention accidental damage during a routine procedure and documentation that would satisfy any investigation. She was planning this like any other transaction, a simple cost-benefit analysis where permanently silencing her child was worth $15,000. When she finally hung up, she informed us that Dr. Baker would arrive at 9 the next morning to address what she called our chronic talking disorder. I stood up slowly, trying to appear defeated rather than determined. Mom watched me carefully as I walked toward my room, and Marcus shifted to ensure he was between me and the front door. I could feel their eyes tracking my movement, waiting for any sign of rebellion. In my room, I pressed my ear against the door and listened to Mom's footsteps heading to her office, probably to update her ledgers with the evening's dramatic charges. My hands shook as I reached between my mattress and box spring, feeling for the phone I had hidden months ago in a carefully cut slit in the fabric. It was an old model with a cracked screen that I had found in the grocery store's lost and found after 90 days unclaimed. I had kept it charged using a cable hidden behind my dresser, knowing that someday I might need it for an emergency. That day had arrived with Dr. Baker's appointment looming in the morning. I held the phone close to the crack under my door, using an app to record Mom's continued phone conversation. She had called Dr. Baker back to discuss additional details, and her voice carried clearly through our thin walls. She was describing exactly how she wanted my vocal cords damaged to appear like a medical complication, while ensuring the damage would be permanent and irreversible. Her tone was casual, like she was ordering furniture, as she discussed destroying her daughter's ability to ever speak again. The recording captured everything, including her mention of the $15,000 payment from my college fund and her request that he bring sedatives strong enough to ensure I couldn't resist. She even discussed Jake, suggesting that if the procedure went well with me, she might schedule him for the following week. Dr. Baker apparently had experience with similar procedures and assured her it could be done without raising suspicions. My stomach churned as I saved the recording in multiple locations on the phone. Sarah and I had developed code phrases for different emergency scenarios during our weeks of planning. I opened our messaging app and typed the one that meant immediate danger requiring outside intervention. Within seconds, she responded that she understood and was taking action. She had contacts from her own escape, people who understood how to navigate systems that often failed abuse victims. While Mom finished her phone call, Sarah was already reaching out to everyone who might help. I forced myself to lay in bed and pretend to sleep when I heard Mom's footsteps approaching for her nightly check. She opened my door, and I felt her presence as she confirmed I was in bed and seemingly resigned to my fate. She stood there for a long moment, perhaps savoring her impending victory, before closing the door and moving on to check on Jake. I heard his door open and close, then her footsteps heading back to review more surveillance footage from the day. My phone vibrated with a message from Sarah saying help was coming, but I needed to document everything I could. Moving as silently as possible, I took photos of the visible cameras in my room, then carefully opened my door to photograph the hallway cameras and the locks on the bathroom door. I knew Mom would review this footage eventually, but by then it would be too late. I even managed to slip into her office while she was in the bathroom and photograph several pages of her ledgers showing the accumulated charges. The crucial evidence was a folder labeled Medical Procedures that contained correspondence with Dr. Baker dating back months. They had been planning this for a long time, discussing various methods of permanent voice elimination and how to make it appear accidental. There were medical diagrams of vocal cord anatomy with handwritten notes about optimal damage points. I photographed every page with shaking hands, knowing these documents would be critical for proving premeditated assault. Around 3 a.m, I heard cars pulling up outside our house. Blue and red lights flashed through my window as police officers surrounded the property. Mom must have had alerts on her security system because I heard her jump out of bed and run to her monitors. But there was nowhere to go and nothing she could do as officers knocked on the door, announcing they had a warrant based on credible reports of child abuse and conspiracy to commit assault. The next few hours blurred together in a chaos of uniforms and questions and documentation. Child Protective Services arrived along with the police, and we were separated for individual interviews. A kind woman named Janet sat with me in the living room as I showed her the recordings, the photographs, the years of surveillance footage that Mom had ironically created to document her own abuse. I watched recognition dawn on Janet's face as she understood the systematic nature of what we had endured. They arrested Mom that night on multiple charges, including child abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. Dr. Baker was arrested at his home an hour later when police found the surgical equipment he had been preparing to bring to our house. Marcus tried to claim he was just following his cousin's instructions and didn't know it was abuse, but the prosecutors charged him as an accomplice. The house that had been our prison became a crime scene, with investigators documenting the surveillance system, the locks, the ledgers, and every piece of evidence. Jake and I were placed in separate foster homes initially, which devastated us both. After everything we had survived together, being apart felt like another punishment. But our social workers understood the bond between us and worked to find a placement that could take us both. 3 weeks later, we moved in with David and Graciela Chen, experienced foster parents who specialized in siblings who had experienced trauma. Their house in Aurora was warm and loud, full of plants and pets and the constant sound of conversation that no one was counting or charging for. The first time Graciela asked what I wanted for breakfast and waited patiently for my answer without pulling out a calculator, I started crying. She didn't push or ask questions, just handed me tissues and made pancakes while humming a little song. Jake didn't speak for the first 2 months, but David and Graciela never pressured him. They had a whiteboard on the refrigerator where he could write what he needed, and they treated his written words with the same respect as spoken ones. Therapy began immediately, though it took time to find the right fit. Our first therapist wanted us to journal about our feelings, not understanding that writing had been banned in our house for years. The second one pushed too hard for verbal processing when we weren't ready. But the third, Dr. Williams, understood trauma and gave us space to heal at our own pace. She had a basket of fidget toys and art supplies, and we could communicate however felt safe. Some sessions were entirely silent, just drawing or building with blocks while she witnessed our pain without demanding words. The trial preparations consumed months of our lives. Prosecutors had to review thousands of hours of surveillance footage, documenting the escalating abuse over years. They brought in financial experts to calculate how much money Mom had extorted from us through her word-charging scheme. Child development specialists testified about the psychological damage of commodifying basic communication. The ledgers that had controlled our lives became state's evidence, labeled and cataloged and analyzed by forensic accountants. Mom insisted on representing herself, which her court-appointed lawyer strongly advised against. She spent her time in jail writing lengthy motions about her First Amendment right to parent as she chose and the valuable life lessons she had been teaching us. She submitted a 100-page brief arguing that charging children for words was no different than charging them for piano lessons or sports equipment. The judge denied every motion and warned her multiple times about courtroom behavior when she tried to charge the prosecutor for his opening statement. Jake testified via closed-circuit television from another room, still unable to speak in Mom's presence, even with her restrained at the defendant's table. His foster dad, David, sat beside him for support as he slowly, carefully told the court about years of silence and hunger and standing punishments. When the prosecutor asked why he had held a knife to his throat, Jake's voice broke as he explained he thought dying was the only way to free me from the debt. Several jurors were crying by the time he finished. I testified in person, determined to use my voice in the courtroom where Mom had tried to steal it forever. I spoke for 2 hours, detailing the surveillance, the escalating rates, the locks on basic necessities, the rice counting, the planned assault by Dr. Baker. I showed the jury my photographs of the medical instruments and played the recording of Mom discussing how to permanently destroy my vocal cords. I looked directly at her as I spoke, watching her frantically scribble notes as if she was still tallying my words. Dr. Baker tried to claim Mom had manipulated him, that he never really intended to go through with the procedure. But prosecutors presented his medical bag containing surgical tools and sedatives he had prepared for that morning appointment. They showed his text messages with Mom discussing payment and technique. His medical license had already been suspended pending investigation, and several former patients came forward with suspicious complications from routine procedures he had performed. His testimony only further damned them both. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 14 separate charges including child abuse, extortion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit assault. Mom showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, just continued writing in her notebook. At sentencing 3 weeks later, the judge allowed victim impact statements from everyone affected by her crimes, including Dad, who flew in from Portland, where he had rebuilt his life. Dad's statement was brief but powerful. He apologized for leaving us in that house, for not fighting harder to take us with him. He told the court about the guilt that had eaten at him for years, the therapy he needed to process abandoning his children to an abuser. He looked at Jake and me as he spoke, tears running down his face, and said he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for choosing his own escape over our protection. The judge sentenced Mom to 8 years in state prison with mandatory psychological treatment and no possibility of early release. He stated that her systematic torture of children through commodifying their basic human need for communication was one of the most creative and cruel forms of abuse he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. He ordered all her assets liquidated to pay for our therapy and education, ensuring that the money she had hoarded while we went hungry would finally benefit us. Mom used her allocution time to deliver a 20-minute speech about ungrateful children and a society that didn't understand visionary parenting. She insisted she would be vindicated by history, that future generations would adopt her word-charging system as a brilliant educational tool. She showed no remorse, no recognition of the harm she had caused, only anger that her experiment had been interrupted. The bailiffs led her away, still talking about the value of words and the cost of raising children who didn't appreciate financial discipline. Dr. Baker received 6 months in county jail and permanent revocation of his medical license. At his separate sentencing, more victims had come forward with stories of unexplained complications and surgical errors that seemed intentional in retrospect. He lost everything, including his reputation, his practice, and his freedom. He sent me an apology letter from jail that I read once before throwing away, not wanting his poisonous words in my life, even as an apology. Recovery wasn't linear or simple. Jake slowly began speaking again, first in therapy, then with our foster parents, eventually with close friends. But he developed a stutter that emerged when he was stressed, a physical reminder of years spent terrified of words. He worked with a speech therapist who specialized in trauma-related communication disorders. Some days were better than others. Some days the stutter was so bad he reverted to writing notes, and we all pretended our eyes weren't wet with shared grief. I struggled with different symptoms. I could speak, but I compulsively counted words in my head, calculating imaginary bills for every conversation. In the grocery store where I still worked, I would mentally tally the cost of talking to customers at Mom's various historical rates. 25 cents for asking about their day, $1 for commenting on the weather, $50 for the friendly chatter that made the job bearable. My therapist called it an intrusive thought pattern that would fade with time and practice. The foster home was a revelation of normal family life. David and Graciela had 3 biological children who were grown and visits from various foster kids they had helped over the years. Dinner was loud and chaotic, with everyone talking over each other, sharing their days, arguing about movies, telling terrible jokes. At first, Jake and I could barely handle the noise, sitting silently while conversation flowed around us. But slowly we began to contribute a word here, a comment there, until we were part of the glorious cacophony. Graciela taught us that words could be gifts rather than commodities. She had a tradition of bedtime stories, reading to us like we were small children, even though I was 18 and Jake was 16. She would do voices for all the characters, making us laugh with her dramatic interpretations. When she finished a chapter, she would ask what we thought would happen next, genuinely interested in our ideas without any charge for sharing them. Those nighttime conversations slowly rebuilt our relationship with language. School became easier as the trial receded into the past. My teachers were informed about our situation and gave me space to participate at my own pace. In English class, I discovered that I actually loved writing when it wasn't forbidden. I wrote essays and stories with a freedom I had never experienced, sometimes using 10 words where one would do just because I could. My teacher entered one of my pieces about finding voice after silence into a contest, and I won second place plus a small scholarship. The scholarship led to more opportunities. Organizations supporting abuse survivors reached out with resources and funding. I applied to colleges with essays about overcoming, about the true cost of silence, about learning that my voice had value beyond any price tag. The acceptances came with financial aid packages that would cover everything, allowing me to pursue social work without debt. The irony wasn't lost on me that Mom's obsession with charging for words had led to me receiving money for writing them. Jake found his own path through debate team of all things. Graciela suggested it, thinking that structured arguments might help with his stutter. The coach was patient and understanding, working with him on breathing techniques and confidence building. The first time he stood at a podium and argued for 20 minutes about education reform, using hundreds of words without stopping or counting, David filmed it with tears streaming down his face. Jake won that debate and discovered he had things to say that people wanted to hear. Our biological father gradually returned to our lives. He started with letters, then phone calls, then supervised visits that became regular dinners. He had remarried to a kind woman named Patricia, who was a therapist herself and understood trauma. They lived in Portland, where Dad worked as a CFO for a nonprofit, using his accounting skills for organizations that helped rather than hurt. He never pushed for more than we were ready to give, but made it clear he would be there whenever we needed him. The old house stood empty for months before going to foreclosure. Mom couldn't pay the mortgage from prison, and no one wanted to buy a home with that much surveillance equipment and custom locks. I drove by one day to see contractors removing the cameras and monitors, loading them into trucks for disposal. One worker held up a camera and jokingly asked if anyone wanted to buy it for $5. I bought it and brought it to my next therapy session, where Dr. Williams and I took turns hitting it with a hammer until it was just plastic fragments and broken glass. College opened new worlds for me. I majored in social work with a minor in psychology, determined to help others trapped in abusive situations that outsiders might not recognize. My professors were impressed by my insight into financial abuse and coercive control, not knowing it came from lived experience rather than textbook study. I wrote my senior thesis on non-physical abuse tactics, using anonymized examples from our case to illustrate how abusers could trap victims without ever laying a hand on them. During my junior year, I met Marcus at a coffee shop near campus. He had served his 6 months and was working construction, trying to rebuild his life. He approached hesitantly, asking if we could talk. I agreed, curious more than angry. He apologized for his role, explaining but not excusing how Mom had manipulated him with money when he was desperate. He said testifying against her was the first right thing he had done in years. I told him I appreciated the apology but couldn't offer forgiveness yet. Maybe someday, but not today. Sarah from the grocery store remained one of my closest friends. She was my maid of honor when I married my college sweetheart, Alex, in a ceremony filled with speeches and toasts and so many words that Mom would have calculated the cost in millions. Sarah's toast made everyone cry as she talked about the scared, silent girl she had met in the break room and the confident woman who now helped other survivors find their voices. She said she knew from that first conversation that I was worth saving, that my voice was meant to be heard. Jake gave a speech at my wedding that lasted 15 minutes and had everyone alternating between laughter and tears. He talked about growing up in silence, about learning to speak again in a foster home full of love, about his sister who saved his life with two-mouthed words. Trust me. He made elaborate jokes and puns and used 5 words where one would do, celebrating the luxury of free speech. His girlfriend Maria stood beside him, rubbing his back during the moments when emotion made his stutter emerge, proving that the right person would love all of him, including his scars. After graduating, I started working at a domestic violence shelter that specialized in non-physical abuse. So many people didn't realize they were being abused because their partners or parents never hit them. They just controlled their money, their movements, their communication, their basic human needs. I developed workshops on recognizing financial abuse and coercive control. I told parts of our story when it helped clients understand they weren't alone, that survival was possible even when escape seemed impossible. The nonprofit I eventually founded focused specifically on what we called economic terrorism within families. We helped document cases where parents charged children rent at inappropriate ages, where spouses controlled every penny, where adult children stole their elderly parents' social security. We provided legal advocacy and emergency funding for people whose abusers had trapped them financially. Every case was different, but echoed familiar themes of money as a weapon and basic needs as leverage. Jake graduated summa cum laude with a degree in communications, which made us both laugh at the irony. He won national debate championships and got recruited by a public relations firm that valued his thoughtful approach to language. He still stuttered when stressed, but he had learned to pause, breathe, and continue rather than letting it silence him. He became an advocate for people with speech differences, arguing that communication was a human right regardless of how words emerged. 5 years after the trial, Mom sent a letter from prison. We had received others over the years, all unopened and returned to sender. But this one came through her lawyer with a legal notice that made us open it. She was claiming we owed her restitution for defamation and theft of services, calculating that our lifetime of words at her rates meant we had stolen millions in unpaid verbal debt. She included meticulously prepared invoices and threatened to sue us upon her release. Our lawyer laughed when we showed him the letter. He filed a restraining order preventing her from any contact upon release and sent a cease and desist regarding her frivolous legal threats. But the letter served as a reminder that she remained unchanged, still viewing words as commodities and her children as debtors. We had the letter framed, not in the kitchen like she had done with Dad's bill, but in my office as a reminder of what we had survived and why our work mattered. The 10-year anniversary of our escape approached with media interest in our story. Journalists wanted to interview us about the word-charging mother and what had become of her children. We agreed to one major interview, hoping our story might help others recognize abuse in its many forms. The reporter asked if we had forgiven Mom, and I gave the answer I always gave. Forgiveness wasn't required for healing. Jake added that forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself, and he wasn't ready for that gift yet. During the interview, they asked what we would say to Mom if we could speak to her without charge. Jake went quiet for a long moment, then said he would tell her about all the words she missed. The jokes he never told, the stories he never shared, the I love yous that never got spoken because they were too expensive. He would tell her about the symphony of conversation she sacrificed for the silence of control. I said I would simply ask her why our words were worth more as currency than as connection. Mom was released after serving her full 8 years, with no time reduced for good behavior because she had continued her word-charging system with cellmates. She had developed an entire economy in her cell block based on verbal transactions until other inmates complained and she was moved to solitary. Upon release, she was required to maintain distance from us and undergo continued psychological treatment. The last we heard, she was living in a small apartment in Wyoming, working at a call center where, ironically, she was paid to talk all day. Our lives continued to unfold in ways we never could have imagined during those silent years. I expanded the nonprofit to 3 cities, helping hundreds of families escape economic abuse. Jake became a partner at his firm and started a scholarship fund for students overcoming communication disorders. We met for dinner every Sunday at a diner between our houses, ordering too much food and talking for hours about everything and nothing. Sometimes we still counted words in our heads, but the numbers no longer had power over us. My daughter was born on a rainy Tuesday morning, screaming her arrival to the world. The nurse commented on her healthy lungs and strong voice, not knowing how those words moved me. As I held her, I whispered promises that her words would always be free, that she could talk or sing or shout without fear of cost. Alex and I named her Sarah Grace after the woman who heard my silence and helped me find my voice again. Jake married Maria 2 years later in a ceremony where his vows made everyone sob. He talked about finding someone who loved his stutter as much as his eloquence, who understood that some scars were worn on the inside but shaped you just as much. He promised to fill their life with words, the silly and the serious, the whispered and the shouted, the carefully planned and the spontaneous. Maria's vows were equally moving, promising to always listen without counting, to value his voice in all its forms. Our father walked me down the aisle at my wedding and stood as Jake's best man at his. He had spent years in therapy processing his guilt about leaving us behind. We had long conversations about impossible choices and survival instincts. I understood that he had been drowning too, and sometimes you can't save anyone else until you save yourself. But he had come back when we needed him, providing testimony that helped convict our abuser and supporting us through recovery. The concept of charging for words occasionally emerged in popular culture as an extreme example of controlling behavior. Psychology textbooks included our case when discussing non-physical abuse. Parenting forums debated whether any form of charging children for basic needs could ever be appropriate. Most agreed that while teaching financial responsibility was important, weaponizing fundamental human needs crossed into abuse. Our story became a cautionary tale about the difference between discipline and cruelty. I sometimes wondered what Mom thought about alone in her apartment, whether she still kept ledgers of imaginary conversations and calculated bills for words never spoken. Did she charge herself for self-talk? Did she maintain her complex rate system for different types of speech? Part of me hoped she had found peace and understanding through therapy. But a larger part knew that some people never recognized their harm, forever convinced they were visionaries rather than villains. The work continued at the nonprofit where we saw every variation of financial control imaginable. Parents who charged toddlers rent, spouses who invoiced for household conversations, adult children who billed elderly parents for visits. Each case reminded us that abuse wore many faces and creative cruelty had no limits. But for every controller, there were survivors finding their voices and advocates helping them speak. The cycle could be broken, one word at a time. Jake's first child arrived 5 years after his wedding, a son they named David after his foster father. Watching Jake talk to his baby, narrating every diaper change and feeding with elaborate stories, healed something in both of us. He would spend hours just chatting with David, celebrating every babble and coo as precious communication. When David spoke his first word, ball, Jake called me crying with joy. His son's words would always be celebrated, never commodified. My therapy practice specialized in survivors of various forms of abuse, particularly those that didn't fit neat categories. I kept tissues and fidget toys and art supplies, remembering how Dr. Williams had given us space to communicate however felt safe. Some clients spoke in torrents, finally free to express years of suppressed thoughts. Others remained nearly silent for months, testing whether this was truly a space without judgment or charge. I witnessed their journey toward reclaiming their voices with profound gratitude. The 20th anniversary of our escape brought reflection on how far we had traveled from those silent children counting pennies for words. Jake had become a renowned speaker on trauma and recovery, traveling nationally to share our story with audiences who needed hope. I had published a book on recognizing and escaping financial abuse that became required reading in several social work programs. We had built lives filled with freely given words and chosen families who celebrated our voices. Sometimes in quiet moments, I still caught myself calculating the cost of conversations at Mom's old rates. A discussion with my daughter about her school day would have cost hundreds at the dollar per word rate of my teenage years. Bedtime stories would have been impossible luxuries. The silly songs we made up together represented thousands of dollars in Mom's economy. But in our house, words were gifts freely given and received, connections rather than transactions. The legacy of our childhood manifested in unexpected ways. Jake became almost compulsively generous with praise and affirmation, as if making up for all the words he couldn't afford to say as a child. I found myself encouraging others to speak up in meetings, to share their ideas without fear of judgment or cost. We both struggled with accepting compliments, some part of us still calculating their value and whether we deserved such expensive words directed our way. Our children grew up in houses filled with conversation, questions welcomed, and stories celebrated. They couldn't imagine a world where words had price tags, where silence was survival, where love was too expensive to speak aloud. When they complained about homework or chores, we remembered standing in corners for hours and counting rice grains for forgiveness. But we didn't share those stories yet. Childhood should be free from the weight of parental trauma. The news of Mom's death came through official channels on a Tuesday afternoon. She had died alone in her apartment, found by a wellness check after missing work for 3 days. The cause was a stroke, sudden and final. Among her possessions were dozens of ledgers documenting imaginary conversations and their calculated costs. She had apparently continued charging herself and invisible others for words until the very end. The estate lawyer asked if we wanted the ledgers, and we both said no simultaneously. We attended the funeral, not for her, but for ourselves. The service was sparse, just Jake and me and a cousin who hoped to inherit something. The minister spoke generic words about loss and heaven, clearly knowing nothing about the woman in the casket. When he asked if anyone wanted to speak, Jake and I remained silent. We had said everything necessary years ago in courtrooms and therapy offices. She had no claim on our words anymore. Afterward, we went to our usual diner and ordered pie and coffee. We talked about our kids, our work, the weather, everything except the woman we had just buried. The waitress kept refilling our cups as we sat there using words freely, generously, carelessly. 3 hours and probably thousands of words later, we paid the reasonable check and left a large tip. Walking to our cars, Jake mentioned that by Mom's final rates, our conversation would have cost more than most people's annual salaries. The irony of her legacy became clearer with time. In trying to teach us the value of words, she had actually taught us their worthlessness when commodified. Real value came from connection, understanding, love, and support. All the things that couldn't be tallied in ledgers or charged by the syllable. Our voices mattered because they carried our truths, not because someone assigned them monetary worth. We had learned the most important lessons in spite of her, not because of her. I kept one photo from childhood, taken before the word charging began. In it, Jake and I were laughing at something Dad had said, our mouths open mid-giggle, clearly chattering away. Mom sat in the background, watching us with an expression I couldn't read. Was she already calculating the cost of our joy? Was she planning her system even then? Or was there a moment when she was just a mother listening to her children laugh? I would never know, and that was okay. Life continued its forward motion, accumulating words and memories and connections. My daughter started kindergarten and came home bursting with stories about new friends and classroom pets. Jake's son began speech therapy for a mild delay, and Jake attended every session, ensuring his child knew that all words were precious, especially the ones that came slowly. We protected our children from our history while giving them the freedom we had been denied. The nonprofit expanded internationally, helping families trapped in economic abuse across cultures and countries. We learned that financial control as a form of abuse was universal, manifesting differently but causing the same damage everywhere. Parents charging children for affection, spouses billing for intimacy, employers stealing wages while demanding gratitude. The word charging was unique to our mother, but the underlying cruelty appeared in countless variations. Speaking at conferences, I often ended with the same message. Your voice has value that no one can calculate or control. Words are meant to be bridges, not barriers. Communication is a human right, not a commodity to be bought and sold. If someone is charging you for basic human needs, including the need to express yourself, that is abuse. It took me years to stop counting the cost of my words, but now I speak freely and encourage others to do the same. The work was never truly finished. There would always be another survivor needing help, another controller finding creative ways to trap their victims. But each person who escaped, each voice reclaimed, each family rebuilt on foundation of free communication felt like victory. We had transformed our trauma into purpose, our silence into advocacy, our survival into hope for others. The ledgers that once controlled us had no power over the lives we built. Sometimes reporters still called, wanting to revisit the sensational story of the mother who charged her children for words. We declined most interviews, preferring to focus on the work rather than the spectacle. Our story had been told in courtrooms and conference rooms, in therapy sessions and support groups. What mattered now was not the past, but the futures we were helping create, one freely spoken word at a time. Looking back from the safety of decades, I could see how we had nearly been destroyed by someone who claimed to be teaching us valuable lessons. But we had learned, just not what she intended. We learned that love shouldn't have a price tag, that communication was connection, not commodity, that survival sometimes meant staying silent until you could safely speak. Most importantly, we learned that voices suppressed would eventually find their way to freedom, no matter the cost. The diner where Jake and I met every Sunday became our sanctuary, a place where words flowed as freely as coffee refills. We talked about our weeks, our families, our dreams still unfolding. Sometimes we sat in comfortable silence, no longer afraid of quiet, but choosing it freely. The waitress knew our orders by heart and often joined our conversations, her words a gift we received gratefully. In that booth, over countless cups of coffee, we continued healing through the simple act of talking without counting. These days, I rarely thought about the precise number of words I spoke. The mental calculator that once tracked every syllable had finally powered down, replaced by the confidence that my voice belonged to me alone. When my daughter asked endless questions, or my clients needed extra sessions, or Jake called just to chat, I responded without tallying costs. Words flowed like breathing, natural and necessary, and free. The story could end here, with freedom found and voices reclaimed. But stories like ours don't really end. They just transform into new chapters. Every survivor who walked through our doors carried their own version of stolen voice and commodified existence. Every child born to those of us who escaped inherited both our freedom and our vigilance. Every word spoken freely was both victory and remembrance of when speaking came with a price we could never afford to pay. In the end, Mom had been right about one thing. Words did have value. But their worth couldn't be captured in ledgers or bills or standing punishments. Their value lay in the connections they created, the truths they revealed, the love they expressed. We had paid enormous prices for our words as children, but as adults we learned that the most valuable conversations were the ones given freely. Our voices were priceless precisely because no one could put a price on them anymore. And so we continued talking, Jake and I and all the survivors who found their voices after years of forced silence. We filled the world with our words, generous and unmetered, making up for all the conversations that had been too expensive to have. In every freely spoken sentence, we reclaimed what had been stolen. In every unjudged expression, we healed what had been broken. In every word shared without fear of cost, we proved that our voices could never truly be silenced, only delayed in their emergence. The ledgers were gone, burned or buried or locked in evidence storage. But our words lived on, multiplying beyond any calculation, too numerous and precious to ever be contained by someone else's accounting. We had learned through pain what should have been birthright, that our voices belonged to us alone. No one could charge us for using them. No one could silence us with debt. No one could make us pay for the fundamental human need to communicate and connect and speak our truths into the world. This was our legacy. Not silence, but chorus. Not debt, but abundance. Not control, but freedom. Every word a choice. Every conversation a gift. Every voice a testament to survival and the unbreakable human spirit that finds a way to speak even when speaking seems impossible. We had been charged for words, but in the end, the only currency that mattered was the courage to use them.